In the quiet of the evening, where shadows softly play, a fairy tale wolf sheds his skin, gently drifting away, with a twinkle in his eye and a heart full of dreams. He waits for the Friday night glow, where the magic redeems. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder for one and for all. In a world of stars dancing, his spirit takes flight, with stories of beauty under the starlit night. He picks up a book, the pages worn and wise, every line a whisper under the vast skies, from far off lands where the wild things roam, to enchanted forests where the heart finds home. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder for one and for all. In a world of stars dancing, his spirit takes flight, with stories of beauty under the starlit night. With every word he reads, he casts a spell of peace, transporting all who listen to a land where joy won't cease. For in these fairy tales, amidst the laughter and tears, the wolf finds his solace, he conquers his fears. As the night grows deeper, he serenades the moon with melodies that linger, a soft and soothing tune. In this sacred hour, where magic abounds, the fairy tale wolf writes love into sound. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder.
You can tell what kind of night it's going to be when I start off muted. Oh. Welcome in, everyone. It is Friday night here in my little bookstore. And what do you want, little cat? Sorry, the tiny meow you might have heard was from my little stripy cat, Arya, who has very sharp needle claws and often end up in my arm when she wants attention. But anyway, it is Friday night, and I'm not really sure how many people are going to show. What is wrong with my camera? What? What do you want, my little girl? Silly baby. You're so sweet, silly baby. She used to be the one who would show up the most on the cat cam when I had it over there, but for some reason, she doesn't, sleep on that bed for some reason. I don't know why. She just, I guess, stopped liking it. Why do you keep meowing? What? What do you want, baby cat? Just gonna sit there and stare at me? I fed her already. Yeah, I fed her 2 hours ago. Even gave her 2 doses of treats. But cats be cats. I am streaming instead of editing the rest of the Mummy. So, chapters 14 and 15 will at least be visible right now. But we need to do fairy tales, and chances are we may even finish this book tonight. Because there's only 5 stories left in this one. So, if you're here, thank you for being here. If you're not here, thank you for watching the VOD. But for now, let's go ahead and get over to the... Ooh, hold on. Ow. That hurt. Okay. Yeah, let's get over to the library. Come on. Oh, duh. Helps if I hit the right button. But anyway. This is why I have pictures on them, so I should know which one's which. The picture that has the fairy on it means I'm doing fairy tales. It makes sense, doesn't it? At least I would hope so. Just like the one using my high emote is for the chat area, meaning the bookstore. One that's just a book in a serious background, it's, the study. No, this is a more serious one. But we're doing fairy tales, so we're in this one. How many? Okay, we're still at 459. Need 41 more followers by the end of the year to hit the goal. I don't know what I do with the goal. I don't know why my mouth isn't moving. I'm gonna recalibrate my camera because I can't. Camera. Yes. Of course, my calibration thing is off the wrong side because I keep my windows small. Ooh, lockjaw. Yeah. At least I don't have to worry about a tongue model. But anyway, ooh, Wizard of Oz. Thank you, Wizard of Oz. I am trying to get more chapters of book 4 done. I've got the first 10 chapters, so I'm halfway through. I'm probably not going to get the chance to work on it tomorrow because I'm doing another road trip, apparently to get furniture. So, furniture not for me, but for my niece. Because she's redoing her cave. And, there's a Stantler in chat. But anyway, Brown Fairy book, almost over. As I said, got only 5 more chapters. And let's see, how many pages is it? Okay, starting on page 181 to page 228. 47 pages. No problem. No problem at all. I may just string longer to finish it. So, feel free to settle back, relax, take a load off your feet, take a load off your mind. That sounds bad, but relax. And see how well I'm going to say this name because it is Dutch. This is from the Volksmärchen der Deutschen. And our first story for this fabulous Friday night of fairy tales is Rubezahl. Over all the vast underworld, the mountain gnome Rubezahl was lord, and busy enough the care enough his dominions kept him. There were endless treasure chambers to be gone through, and a host of gnomes to be kept to their tasks. Some built strong barriers to hold back the fiery vapors, to change dull stones to precious metals, or were hard at work filling every cranny of the rocks with diamonds and rubies. For Rubezahl loved all pretty things. Sometimes the fancy would take him to leave those gloomy regions and come out upon the green earth for a while, and bask in the sunshine and hear the birds sing. And, as gnomes live hundreds of years, he saw strange things. For, the first thing he came up, the great hills were covered with thick forests in which wild animals roamed, and Rubezahl watched the fierce fights between a bear and bison, or chased the gray wolves, or amused himself by rolling great rocks down to the desolate valleys, to hear the thunder of their fall echoing among the hills. But the next time he ventured above ground, what was his surprise to find everything changed. The dark woods were hewn down, and in their place appeared blossoming orchards surrounding cozy-looking thatched cottages, for every chimney the blue smoke curled peacefully into the air. Sheep and oxen fed in the flowery meadows, while from the shade of the hedges came the music of the shepherd's pipe. The strangeness and pleasantness of the sight so delighted the gnome that he never thought of resenting the intrusion of the unexpected guests, who, without saying by your leave or with your leave, made themselves so very much at home upon the hills, nor did he wish to interfere with their doings, but he left them in quiet possession of their homes, as a good householder leaves in peace the swallows who built their nests under his eaves. He was indeed greatly minded to make friends with this being called man, so taking the form of an old field laborer, he entered the service of a farmer. Under his care all the crops flourished exceedingly, but the master proved to be wasteful and ungrateful, and Rubezahl soon left him and went to the shepherd, to his next-door neighbor. He tended the flock so diligently, and knew so well where to lead the sheep to the sweetest pastures, and where among the hills to look for those who strayed away. And they too prospered under his care, and not one was lost or torn by wolves. But this new master was a hard man, and begrudged him all his well-earned wages. So he ran away, and went to serve the judge. Here he upheld the law with might and main, and was a terror to thieves and evildoers. But the judge was a bad man, who took bribes, and despised the law. Rubezahl would not be the tool of an unjust man, and so he told his master, who thereupon ordered him to be thrown into prison. Of course, that did not trouble the gnome at all. He simply got out through a keyhole, and went down his way to the underground palace, very much disappointed by his first experience with mankind. But as time went on, he forgot the disagreeable things that had happened to him, and thought he would take another look at the upper world. So he stole into the valley, keeping himself carefully hidden in the copse or hedgerow, and very soon he met with an adventure, for peeping through the screen of leaves, he saw before him a green lawn where stood a charming maiden, fresh as the spring and beautiful to look upon. Around her upon the grass lay her young companions, as if they had thrown themselves down to rest after some merry game. Beyond them flowed a little brook, into which a waterfall leapt from a high rock, filling the air with its pleasant sound, and making a coolness even in the sultry noontide. The sight of the maiden so pleased the gnome that for the first time he wished himself immortal, and longing for a better view of the gay company, he changed himself into a raven and perched upon an oak tree which overhung the brook. But he soon found that this was not at all a good plan. He could only see with a raven's eyes and feel as a raven feels, and a nest of field mice at the foot of the tree interested him far more than the sport of the maiden. When he undertook this, he flew down again in a great hurry to the thicket, and took the form of a handsome young man. That was the best way, and he fell in love with the girl then and there. The fair maiden was the daughter of the king of the country, and she often wandered in the forest with her playfellows gathering the wild flowers and fruits, till the midday heat drove the merry band to the shady lawn by the brook to rest, or to bathe in the cool waters. On this particular morning the fancy took them to wander off again into the wood. This was Master Rubezahl's opportunity. Stepping out from his hiding place, he stood in the midst of a little lawn, weaving his magic spells, till slowly all about him changed, and when the maidens returned at noon to their favorite resting place, they stood lost in amazement, and almost fancied that they must be dreaming. The red rocks had become white marble and alabaster. The stream that murmured and struggled before it in its rocky bed flowed in silence now in its smooth channel, from which the clear fountain leapt, and to fall in showers and diamond drops, now on this side and now that, as the wandering breeze scattered it. Daisies and forget-me-nots fringed its brink, while tall hedges of roses and jasmine ringed it around, making the sweetest and daintiest bower imaginable. To the right and the left of the waterfall opened out a wonderful grotto, its walls and arches glittering with many-colored rock crystals, while in every niche were spread the strange fruits of sweetmeats, the very sight of which made the princess long to taste them. She hesitated a while, however, scarcely able to believe her eyes, and not knowing if she should enter the enchanted spot or fly from it. But at length curiosity prevailed, and she and her companions explored to their heart's content, and tasted and examined everything, running hither and thither in high glee, and calling merrily to each other. At last, when they were quite weary, the princess cried out suddenly that nothing would content her but to bathe in the marble pool, which certainly did look very inviting, and they all went gaily to this new amusement. The princess was ready first, but scarcely had she slipped over the rim of the pool when down, down, down she sank, and vanished into its depths before her frightened playmates could seize her by so much as a lock of her floating golden hair. Loudly did they weep and wail, running about the brink of the pool, which looked so shallow and so clear, but which had swallowed up their princess before their eyes. They even sprang into the water and tried to dive after her, but in vain. They only floated like corks in the enchanted pool, and could not keep under water for a second. They saw at last there was nothing to do for it but to carry to the king the sad tidings of his beloved daughter's disappearance. And what great weeping and lamentation there was in the palace when this dreadful news was told! The king tore his robes, dashed his golden crown from his head, and hid his face in his purple mantle for grief and anguish at the loss of his princess. After the first outburst of wailing, however, he took heart and hurried off to see for himself the scene of this strange adventure, thinking, as people will in sorrow, that there might be some mistake after all. But when he reached the spot, behold, all was changed again. The glittering grotto described to him by the maidens had completely vanished, and so had the marble bath, the bower of jasmine, indeed all the tangible flowers, as it had been told. The king was much perplexed that he threatened the princess's playfellows with all sorts of punishments if they would not confess something about her disappearance. But as they only repeated the same story, he presently put the whole affair to the work of some sprite or goblin, and tried to console himself for his loss by ordering a grand hunt, for kings cannot bear to be troubled about anything for long. Meanwhile, the princess was not at all unhappy in the palace of her elfish lover. When the water nymphs, who were hiding in the readiness, had caught her and dragged her out of the sight of the terrified maidens, she herself had not had time to be frightened. They swam with her quickly to the strange underground ways to a palace so splendid that her father's seemed but a poor cottage in comparison with it. And when she recovered from her astonishment, she found herself seated upon a couch, wrapped in a wonderful robe of satin fastened with a silken girdle, while beside her knelt a young man who whispered the sweetest speeches imaginable into her ear. The gnome, for it was he, told her all about himself and his great underground kingdom, and presently led her through the many rooms and halls of the palace, and showed her the rare and wonderful things displayed in them until she was fairly dazzled at the sight of so much splendor. On three sides of the castle lay a lovely garden with masses of gay sweet flowers, and velvet lawns, all cool and shady, which pleased the eye of the princess. The fruit trees were hung with golden and rosy apples. The nightingale sang in every bush. As the gnome and the princess wandered in the leafy alleys, sometimes gazing at the moon, sometimes pausing to gather the rarest flowers of her adornment. And all the time he was thinking to himself that never, during the hundreds of years he had lived, he had been so charming a maiden. But the princess felt no such happiness. In spite of all the magic delights around her, she was sad, though she tried to seem content for fear of displeasing the gnome. However, he soon perceived her melancholy, and in 1,000 ways strove to dispel the cloud, but in vain. At last he said to himself, "Men are social creatures like bees and ants. Doubtless this lovely mortal is pining for company. Who is there I can find for her to talk to?" Thereupon he listened into the nearest field and dug up a dozen or so different roots, carrots, turnips, and radishes, and laying them carefully in an elegant basket, brought them to the princess, who sat pensive in the shade of a rose bower. "Loveliest daughter of earth," said the gnome, "banish all sorrow. No more shall you be lonely in my dwelling, and this basket is all you need to make the spot delightful to you. Take this many-colored wand, and give a touch to each root the form you desire to see." With this he left her, and the princess, without an instant's delay, opened the basket, and touching a turnip, cried eagerly, "Brunhilde, my dear Brunhilde, come to me quickly!" And sure enough, there was Brunhilde, joyfully hugging and kissing her beloved princess, and chattering as gaily as in the old days. The sudden appearance was so delightful that the princess could hardly believe her own eyes, and was quite beside herself with the joy of having her dear playfellow with her once more. Hand in hand they wandered about the enchanted garden, gathering the golden apples from the tree, and when they were tired of this amusement, the princess led her friend through all the wonderful rooms of the palace, until at last they came to the one in which were kept all the marvelous dresses and ornaments the gnome had given to his hoped-for bride. There they found so much to amuse them that the hours passed like minutes. Veils, girdles, and necklaces were tried on and admired. An imitation Brunhilde knew so how well. The imitation Brunhilde knew so well how to behave herself, and showed so much taste that nobody would ever have suspected that she was nothing but a turnip after all. The gnome, who had secretly been keeping an eye upon them, was very pleased with himself for having so well understood the heart of a woman, and the princess seemed to him even more charming than before. She did not forget to touch the rest of the roots with her magic wand, and soon had all of her handmaidens around her, and even as she had 2 tiny radishes to spare, her favorite cat and a little dog, whose name was Benny. And now all went cheerfully into the castle. The princess gave each of the maidens her task, and never was the mistress better served. For a whole week she enjoyed the delight of her pleasant company undisturbed. They all sang, they danced, and they played from morning to night. Only the princess noticed that, day by day, the fresh young faces of her maidens grew pale and wan, and the mirror in the great marble hall showed her that she was alone, and still kept her rosy bloom, while Brunhilde and the rest visibly faded. They assured her that all was well with them, but nevertheless they continued to waste away, And day by day it became harder to them to take part in the games of the princess, till at last, one fine morning, when the princess started from bed and hastened to join her gay playfellows, she shuddered and started back at the sight of the group of shriveled crones, with bent backs and trembling limbs, who supported their tottering steps with staves and crutches, and coughed dismally. A little nearer to the hearth lay the once frolicsome Benny, with all 4 feet stretched stiffly out, while the sleek cat seemed too weak to raise his head from his velvet cushion. The horrified princess fled to the door to escape from the sight of this mournful company, and called loudly for the gnome, who appeared at once, humbly anxious to do her bidding. "Malicious sprite!" she cried, "why do you begrudge me my playmates, the greatest delight of my lonely hours? Isn't this solitary life in such a desert bad enough without your turning the castle into a hospital for the aged? Give my maidens back their youth and health this very minute, or I will never love you." "Sweetest and fairest of damsels," cried the gnome, "do not be angry. Everything that is in my power I will do, but do not ask the impossible. So long as the sap was fresh in the roots, the magic staff would keep them in the forms you desired, but as the sap dried up, they withered away. But never trouble yourself about that, dearest one. A basketful of fresh turnips will be set mattering right, and you can speedily call up again every form you wish to see. The great green patch in the garden will prove you with more lively company." So saying, the gnome took himself off, and the princess, with her magic wand, touched the wrinkled old women, and left them in the withered roots that they really were, to be thrown out upon the garbage heap, and with light feet skipped across the meadow to take possession of the freshly filled basket. But to her surprise she could not find it anywhere. Up and down the garden she searched, spying into every corner, but not a sign of it was to be found. By the trellis of grapevine she met the gnome, who was so much embarrassed at the sight of her that she became aware of his confusion, while he was still quite a long way off. "Are you trying to tease me?" she cried, as soon as she saw him. "Where have you hidden the basket? I've been looking for it at least an hour." "Dear queen of my heart," answered he, "I pray you forgive my carelessness. I promised more than I could perform. I've sought over the land for the roots you desire, but they are all gathered in, and lie drying in the musty cellar, and the fields are bare and desolate, for below in the valley winter reigns. Only here in your presence spring is held fast, and wherever your foot is set gay flowers bloom. Have patience for a little, and without fail you shall have your puppets to play with." Almost before the gnome had finished, the disappointed princess turned away and marched off to her own apartments without deigning to answer him. The gnome, however, set off above ground as speedily as possible, and disguising himself as a farmer, bought an ass in the nearest market town, and brought it back loaded with sacks of turnips, carrots, and radish seeds. With this he sowed a great field, and sent a vast army of his goblins to tend and watch it, and bring up the fiery rivers from the heart of the earth near enough to warm and encourage the sprouting seeds. Thus fostering they grew and flourished marvelously, and promised a verdant crop. The princess wandered about the field all day. No other plants or fruits in all the wonderful garden pleased her so much as these roots, but her eyes were still full of discontent. And best of all, she loved to while away the hours in the shady fir wood, seated upon the bank of a little stream, into which she would cast the flowers she had gathered and watch them float away. The gnome tried hard by every means in his power to please the princess and win her love, but little did he guess the real reason of his lack of success. He imagined that she was too young and inexperienced to care for him, but that was a mistake, for the truth was that another image had already filled her heart. The young Prince Ratibor, whose lands joined her father's, had won the heart of the princess, and the lovers had been looking forward to coming to their wedding day when the bride's mysterious disappearance took place. The sad news drove Ratibor distracted, and as the days went on and nothing could be heard of the princess, he forsook his castle and the society of men, and spent his days in the wild forests, roaming about and crying her name aloud to the rocks and trees. Meanwhile, the maiden in her gorgeous prison sighed in secret over her grief, not wishing to arouse the gnome's suspicions. In her own mind she was wondering if by any means she might escape from her captivity, and at last she hit upon a plan. By this time, spring once more reigned in the valley, and the gnomes sent the fires back to their places in the depths of the earth, for the roots which they had kept warm through all the cruel winter had now come to their full size. Day by day the princess pulled up some of them, and made experiments with them, conjuring up now the forlonged person, and now that, just for the pleasure of seeing them as it appeared, but she really had another purpose in mind. One day she changed a tiny turnip into a bee, and sent him off to bring her some news of her lover. "Fly, dear little bee, towards the east," said she, "to my beloved Ratibor, and hum softly into his ear that I love him only, but that I am a captive in the gnome's palace under the mountains. Do not forget a single word of my greeting, and bring me back a message from my beloved." So the bee spread his shining wings and flew away to do as he was bidden. But before he was out of the sight, a greedy swallow made a snatch at him, and to the great grief of the princess, her messenger was eaten up then and there. After that, and by the power of the wonderful wand, she summoned a cricket, and taught him this greeting. "Hop, little crickets, to Rathbor, and chirp in his ear that I love him only, but that I am held captive by the gnome in his palace under the mountains." So the cricket hopped off gaily, and determined to do his best to deliver his message. But alas, a long-necked stork who was prancing along the same road caught him in her cruel beak, and before he could say a word, he had disappeared down her throat. These two unlucky ventures did not prevent the princess from trying once more. This time she changed a turnip into a magpie. "Flutter from tree to tree, chattering bird," said she, "till you come to Ratibor, my love. Tell him that I am captive, and bid him to come with horses and men the third day from this, to the hill that rises from Thorny Valley." The magpie listened, hopped a while from branch to branch, and then darted away, the princess watching him anxiously as far as she could see. Now Prince Ratibor was still spending his life wandering about the woods, and not even the beauty of the spring could soothe his grief. One day, as he sat by the shade of an oak tree, dreaming of his lost princess, and sometimes crying her name aloud, he seemed to hear another voice reply to his, and starting up, he gazed around him, but could see no one, and he had just made up his mind that he must be mistaken, when the same voice called again, and looking up sharply, he saw a magpie which hopped to and fro among the twigs. Then Ratibor heard with surprise that the bird was indeed calling by his name. "Poor chatterboy," said he, "who taught you to say my name, which belongs to an unlucky mortal who wishes the earth would open up and swallow him and his memory forever?" Thereupon he caught up a great stone, and would have hurled it at the magpie, if it had not been that moment uttered the name of the princess. This was so unexpected that the prince's arm fell helplessly to his side at the sound, and he stood motionless. But the magpie in the tree, who, like all the rest of his family, was not unhappy unless he could be forever chattering, began to repeat the message the princess had taught him, and as soon as he understood it, Prince Radibor's heart was filled with joy. His gloom and misery vanished in a moment, and he anxiously questioned the welcome messenger as to the fate of his princess. But the magpie knew no more than the lesson he had learnt, so he soon fluttered away, while the prince hurried back to his castle to gather together a troop of horsemen, full of courage for whatever might befall. The princess, meanwhile, was craftily pursuing her plan of escape. She left off treating the gnome with coldness and indifference. Indeed, there was a look in her eyes which encouraged him to hope that she might some day return his love, and the idea pleased him mightily. The next day, as soon as the sun rose, she made her appearance decked as a bride in the wonderful robes and jewels which the fond gnome had prepared for her. Her golden hair was braided and crowned with myrtle blossoms, and her flowing veil sparkled with gems. In these magnificent garments she went to meet the gnome upon the great terrace. "Loveliest of maidens," he stammered, bowing low before her, "let me gaze into your dear eyes, and read in them that you will no longer refuse my love, but will make me the happiest being the sun shines upon." So saying, he would have drawn aside her veil, but the princess only held it more closely about her. Your consistency has overcome me, said she. I can no longer oppose your wishes, but believe my words and suffer the veil till to hide my blush and my tears. Why tears, beloved one? Cried the gnome anxiously. Every tear of yours falls upon my heart like a drop of molten gold. Greatly as I desire your love, I do not ask a sacrifice. Ah, cried the false princess, why do you misunderstand my tears? My heart answers to your tenderness, and yet I am fearful. A wife can always be. A wife can always cannot. A wife cannot always charm, and though you will never alter, the beauty of mortals is like a flower that fades. How can I be sure that you will always be as loving and charming as you are now? Ask some proof, sweetheart, said he. Put my obedience and my patience to some test by which you can judge my unalterable love. Be it so, answered the crafty maiden. Give me just one last proof of your goodness. Go, count the turnips in yonder meadow. My wedding feast must not lack guests. They shall provide me with the bridemaidens too, but beware lest you deceive me. Do not miss a single one. That shall be the test of your truth towards me. Unwilling as the gnome was to lose sight of his beautiful bride for a moment, he obeyed her commands without delay and hurried off to begin his task. He skipped along the turnips as nimble as a grasshopper, and had soon counted them all, but to be quite certain that he made no mistake, he thought he would just run over them again. This time, to his great annoyance, the number was different, so he reckoned them for a third time. But now the number was not the same as the previous sessions, and this was hardly to be wondered, as his mind was full of the princess's looks and beauty. As for the maiden, no sooner was her deluded lover fairly out of sight than she began to prepare for flight. She had a fine fresh turnip hidden close at hand, which she changed into a spirited horse, all saddled and bridled, and springing upon its back, she galloped away over hill and dale till she reached the thorny valley, and flung herself into the arms of her beloved Prince Ratibor. Meanwhile, the toiling gnome went through the task over and over again until his back ached and his head swam, and he could no longer put two and two together. But as he felt tolerably certain of the exact number of turnips in the field, big and little together, he hurried back eagerly to prove to his beloved one what a delightful and submissive husband he would have been. He felt very well satisfied with himself as he crossed the mossy lawn to the place where he had left her. But alas, she was no longer there. He searched every thicket and path. He looked behind every tree and gazed into every pond, but without success. Then he hastened to the palace and rushed from room to room, peering into every hole and corner, and calling her by name. But only echo answered in the marble halls. There was neither voice nor footstep. Then he began to perceive that something was amiss, and throwing off the mortal form that encumbered him, he flew out of the palace and soared high into the air, and saw the fugitive princess in the far distance, just as the swift horse carried her across the boundary of his dominions. Furiously did the enraged gnome fling two great clouds together and hurl a thunderbolt after the flying maiden, splintering the rocky barriers which had stood 1,000 years. But his fury was in vain. The thunderclouds melted away into a soft mist, and the gnome, after flying about for a while in despair, bewailing to the four winds his unhappy fate, went sorrowfully back to the palace, and stole once more through every room with many a sigh and lamentations. He passed through the gardens, which for him had lost their charm, and the sight of the princess's footsteps on the golden sand of the pathway renewed his grief. All was lonely, empty, and sorrowful, and the forsaken gnome resolved that he would have no more dealings with such false creatures as he had found men to be. Thereupon he stamped 3 times upon the earth, and the magic palace, with all its treasures, vanished away into nothingness out of what she had called it. The gnome fled once more to the depths of his underground kingdom. While all of this was happening, Prince Ratibor was hurrying away with his pride to his place of safety. With great pomp and triumph he restored the lovely princess to her father, and was then and there married to her, and took her back with him to his own castle. But long after she was dead, and her children too, The villagers would tell the tale of her imprisonment underground as they sat carving wood on the winter nights. Just can't make a woman happy. Though, the turnip people, yeah, that could have at least made it possible for her to visit her real friends, but still, she was already in love with someone else, so yeah. Anyway, our next story for this fabulous Friday night of fairy tales. Story of the king who would be stronger than fate. Once upon a time, far away in the East Country, there lived a king who loved hunting so much that when there was a deer in sight, he was careless of his own safety. Indeed, he often became quite separated from his nobles and attendants, and in fact was particularly fond of lonely adventures. Another of his favorite amusements was to give out that he was not well, and could not be seen, and then, with the knowledge only of his faithful Grand Vizier, to disguise himself as a peddler, load a donkey with cheap wares, and travel about. In this way he found out what the common people said about him, and how his judges and governors fulfilled their duties. One day his queen presented him with a baby daughter as beautiful as the dawn, and the king himself was so happy and delighted that for a full week he forgot to hunt, and spent the time in public and private rejoicing. Not long afterwards, however, he went out after some deer which were to be found in the far corner of his forest. In the course of the beat his dogs disturbed this beautiful snow-white stag, and directly he saw it, the king determined that he would have it at any cost. So he put the spurs to his horse and followed it as hard as he could gallop. Of course, all his attendants followed at the best speed they could manage, but the king was so splendidly mounted, and the stag was so swift, that at the end of an hour the king found that only his favorite hound and himself were in the chase, as the rest were far, far behind and out of sight. Nothing daunted, however, he went on, till he perceived that he was entering a valley with great rocky mountains on all sides, and that his horse was getting very tired and trembled at every stride. Worse than all, evening was drawing on, and the sun would soon set. In vain he sent an arrow after the beautiful stag, and every shot fell short, or went wide from the mark, and at last, just as darkness was setting in, he lost sight altogether of the beast. By this time his horse could hardly move from fatigue, and his hound staggered panting along beside him. He was as far away amongst the mountains as he had ever been before, and had quite missed his way, and not a human creature or dwelling was in sight. All this was very discouraging, but the king would not have minded if he had not lost the beautiful stag. That troubled him a good deal, but he never worried over what he could not help, so he got down from his horse and slipped his arm through the bridle, and then led the animal along the rough path in hopes of discovering some shepherd's hut, or at least a cave or shelter under some rock, where they might pass the night. Presently he heard the sound of rushing water, and made towards it. He toiled over a steep rocky shoulder of a hill, and there, just below him, with the stream dashing down in precipitous glen, and almost beneath his feet, twinkling and flickering from the level of the torrent, was the dim light of a lamp. Towards this light the king with his horse and hound made their way, sliding and stumbling down a steep, stony path. At the bottom the king found a narrow grassy ledge by the brink of the stream, across from which the light from the rude lantern was the mouth of a cave, shed a broad beam of uncertain light. At the edge of the stream sat an old hermit with a long white beard, who neither spoke nor moved as the king approached, but sat throwing into the stream dry leaves which lay scattered about the ground near him. "Peace be upon you," said the king, giving the usual country salutation. "And upon you peace," answered the hermit, but still he never looked up, nor stopped what he was doing. For a moment or two the king stood watching him. He noticed that the hermit threw 2 leaves in at a time, and watched them attentively. Sometimes both were carried rapidly down by the stream, sometimes only one leaf was carried off, and the other, after swirling slowly around on the edge of the current, would come back circling back on the eddy to the hermit's feet. At other times, both leaves were held in the backward eddy and failed to reach the main current of the noisy stream. "What are you doing?" asked the king at last, and the hermit replied that he was reading the fates of men. Everyone's fate, he said, was settled from the beginning, and whatever it were, there was no escape from it. The king laughed. "I care little," he said, "what my fate may be, but I should be curious to know the fate of my little daughter." "I cannot say," said the hermit. "Do you not know, then?" demanded the king. "I might know," returned the hermit, "but it is not always wisdom to know much." But the king was not content with this reply, and began to press the old man to say what he knew. For a long time he would not do so. At last, however, the king urged him so greatly that he said, "The king's daughter will marry the son of a poor slave girl named Peruna, who belongs to the king of the land of the north. There is no escaping from fate." The king was wild with anger at hearing these words, but he was also very tired, so he only laughed and answered that he hoped there would be a way out of that fate anyhow. Then he asked if the hermit could shelter him and his beast for the night, and the hermit said yes. So very soon the king had wandered and tethered his horse, and after a supper of bread and parched peas, lay down in the cave with the hound at his feet, and tried to go to sleep. But instead of sleeping, he only lay awake and thought of the hermit's prophecy, and the more he thought of it, the angrier he felt, until he gnashed his teeth and declared that it should never, never come true. Morning came, and the king got up, pale and sulky, and, after learning from the hermit which path to take, was soon mounted and found his way home without much difficulty. Directly he reached his palace, he wrote a letter to the king of the land of the north, begging him, as a favor, to sell him his slave girl Peruna and her son, and saying that, if he consented, he would send a messenger to receive them at the river which divided the kingdom. For 5 days he waited for a reply, and hardly slept or ate, but was cross as he could be all the time. On the 5th day his messenger returned with a letter to say the king of the land of the north would not sell, but he would give, the king the slave girl and her son. The king was overjoyed. He sent for his grand vizier and told him he was going on one of his lonely expeditions, and that the vizier must invent some excuse to accuse him of absence. Next he disguised himself as an ordinary messenger, mounted a swift camel, and sped away to the place where the slave girl was to be handed over to him. When he got there, he gave the messengers who brought her a letter of thanks and a handsome present for their master, and rewards for themselves, and then without delay took the poor woman and her tiny baby boy up to his camel and rode off to a wild desert. After riding for a day and a night, almost without stopping, he came to a great cave where he made the woman dismount, and taking her and her baby into the cave, drew his sword and with one blow chopped off her head. But although his anger made him cruel enough for anything so dreadful, the king felt that he could not turn his great sword on a helpless baby, who he was sure must die in a solitary place without his mother. So he left it in his cave where it was, and mounting his camel, rode home as fast as he could. Now, in a small village in his kingdom there lived an old widow who had no children or relations of any kind. She made her living mostly by selling the milk of a flock of goats, but she was very, very poor, and not very strong, and often used to wonder how she would live if she got too weak or ill to attend her goats. Every morning she drove the goats out to the desert to graze on the shrubs and bushes which grew there, and every evening she came home with themselves to be milked and to be shut up safely for the night. One evening the old woman was astonished to find that the very best nanny goat returned without a drop of milk. She thought that some naughty boy or girl was playing a trick on her and had caught the goat on its way home and stolen all her milk. But when evening after evening the goat remained almost dry, she determined to find out who the thief was. So the next day she followed the goats out to the distance and watched them while they grazed. At length, in the afternoon, the old woman noticed this particular nanny goat stealing off by herself away from the herd, and at once she went after her. On and on the goat walked for some way, then he disappeared into a cave, and then what should she see but the animal giving her milk, the little baby boy, whilst on the ground nearby lay the sad remains of the baby's dead mother. Wondering and frightened, the old woman thought at last that this baby might be a son to her in her old age, and that he would grow up and in time come to comfort her and support. She carried home the baby to her hut, and the next day she took a spade to the cave to dig a grave where she buried the poor mother. Years passed by, and the baby grew up to be a fine, handsome lad, and daring as he was beautiful, and industrious as he was brave. One day, when the boy, whom the old woman had named Nur Muhammad, was about 17 years old, he was coming from his day's work to the fields, and he saw a strange donkey eating the cabbages in the garden which surrounded their little cottage. Seizing a big stick, he began to beat the intruder to drive him out of the garden. A neighbor passing by called out to him, "Hi, I say, why are you beating the peddler's donkey like that?" "The peddler should keep him from eating my cabbages," said Nur Muhammad. "If he comes this evening here again, I'll cut off his tail for him." Whereupon he went indoors, whistling cheerfully. It happened that this neighbor was one of the people who had made mischief by talking too much, and so meeting the peddler in the Sarah, or inn, that evening, he told him what had occurred, and added, "Yes, and the young Spitfire said that if beating the donkey would not do, he would beat you also, and cut off your nose for a thief." A few days later, the peddler having moved on, two men appeared in the village inquiring who it was who threatened to ill-treat, to murder an innocent peddler. They declared that the peddler, in fear of his life, had complained to the king, and that he had been sent to bring the lawless person who had said these things before the king himself. Of course, they soon found out about the donkey eating Nur Muhammad's cabbages, and about the young man's hot words. But although the lad assured them that he never said anything about murdering anyone, they replied that they were ordered to arrest him and bring him to take the trial before the king. So in spite of his protests and the wails of his mother, he was carried off, and in due time brought before the king. Of course, Nur Muhammad never guessed that the supposed peddler happened to be the king himself, although nobody knew it. But he was very angry at what he had been told, and he declared that he was going to make an example of this young man, and intended to teach him that the poor traveling peddlers should get justice in his country, and be protected from such lawlessness. However, just as he was going to pronounce some heavy sentence, there was a stir in the court, and up came Nur Muhammad's old mother, weeping and lamenting and begging to be heard. The king ordered her to speak, and she began to plead for the boy, declaring how good he was, and how he was the support of her old age, and if he was put in prison she would die. The king asked her who she was, and she replied that she was his mother. "His mother?" said the king. "You are too old, surely, to have such a young son." Then the old woman, in her fright and distress, confessed the whole story of how she found the baby, and how she rescued and brought him up, and ended by beseeching the king for mercy. It was easy to guess how, as the story came out, the king looked blacker and blacker, and more grim, until at last he was half fainting with rage and astonishment. This, then, was the baby he had left to die, and after cruelly murdering his mother. Surely fate must have spared him this. He wished he had sufficient excuse to put the boy to death, for the old hermit's prophecy had come back to him as strongly as ever, and yet the young man had done nothing bad enough to deserve such punishment. Everyone would call him a tyrant if he were to give such an order. In fact, he dared not try it. At length he collected himself enough to say, "If this young man will enlist in my army, I will let him off. We have need of such as him, and a little discipline will do him good." Still, the old woman pleaded that she could not live without her son, and was nearly as terrified at the idea of his becoming a soldier as she was being thought of the king put in prison. But at length the king, determined to get the youth into his clutches, pacified her by promising a pension large enough to keep her in comfort, and Nur Muhammad, to his great delight, was duly enrolled in the king's army. As a soldier, Nur Muhammad seemed to be in luck. He was rather surprised, but much pleased, to find that he was always one of those chosen with a difficult and dangerous enterprise was afoot, and although he had the narrowest escapes on some occasions, still the very desperateness of the situations in which he found himself gave him special chances of displaying his courage. And as he was also modest and generous, he became the favorite with his officers and his comrades. This was not very surprising that, before very long, he became enrolled amongst the picked men of the king's bodyguard. The fact is that the king had hoped to have gotten him killed in some fight or another, but seeing that, on the contrary, he drove on hard knocks, and he was now determined to try more direct and desperate methods. One day soon, after Muhammad had entered the bodyguard, he was selected to be one of the soldiers told off to escort the king through the city. The procession was marching on quite smoothly when a man, armed with a dagger, rushed out of an alley straight towards the king. Nur Muhammad, who was the nearest of the guards, threw himself in the way and received a stab that had been apparently intended for the king. Luckily, the blow was a hurried one, and the dagger glanced off his breastbone, so that, although he received a severe wound, his youth and strength quickly got the better of it. The king was, of course, obliged to take some notice of this brave deed, and as a reward made him one of his own attendants. After this strange adventures the young man passed through were endless. Officers of the bodyguard were often sent on all sorts of secret and difficult errands, and such errands had a curious way of becoming necessary when Nur Muhammad was on duty. Once, while he was taking a journey, a footbridge gave way under him. Once he was attacked by armed robbers. A rock rolled down a hill on him in a mountain pass. A heavy stone coping fell from a roof at the feet in the narrow city alley. Altogether, Nur Muhammad began to think that somewhere or other he had made an enemy, but he was light-hearted and thought not much to trouble him. He escaped somehow every time and felt amused rather than anxious about the next adventure. It was a custom of the city that an officer for the day had to be the palace guard should receive all his food direct from the king's kitchen. One day, when Nur Muhammad's turn came to be on duty, he was just sitting down to a delicious stew that had been sent in from the palace, when one of the gaunt, hungry dogs, which in eastern countries run about the streets, poked his nose in the open guardroom door and looked at Nur Muhammad with a mouth watering and nostrils working. The kind-hearted youth picked up the lump of meat and went to the door and threw it outside to him. The dog pounced upon it and gulped it down greedily, and was turning to go when it staggered, fell, rolled over, and died. Nur Muhammad, who had been lazily watching him, stood still for a moment, and then came back whistling softly. He gathered up the rest of his dinner and carefully wrapped it up to carry away and bury somewhere, and then he sent back the empty plates. How furious the king was when, in the morning's debar, Nur Muhammad appeared before him, fresh, alert, and smiling as usual. He was determined, however, to try once more, and bidding the young man come into his presence that evening, gave orders that he was to carry the secret dispatch to the governor of the distant province. "Make your preparations at once," he said, "and be ready to start in the morning. I will deliver you the papers at the last moment." Now, this province was 4 or 5 journeys away. Now, this province was 4 or 5 days' journey from the palace, and the governor of it was the most faithful servant the king had. He could be silent as the grave and prided himself on his obedience. Whilst he was an old and tried servant of the king's, his wife had almost been the mother of the young princess ever since the queen had died some years before. It happened that, a little before this time, the princess had been sent away for her health to another remote province, and while she was there, her old friend, the governor's wife, had begged her to come and stay with them as soon as she could. The princess accepted gladly, and was actually staying in the governor's house at the very time when the king made up his mind to send Nur Muhammad there with the mysterious dispatch. According to orders, Nur Muhammad presented himself early the next morning to the king's private apartments. His best horse was saddled, food placed in the saddlebag, and with some money tied to his waistband, he was ready to start. The king handed over the sealed packet, desiring him to give it only to the hands of the governor and to no one else. Nur Muhammad hid it carefully in his turban, swung himself into the saddle, and 5 minutes later rode out of the city gates and set out for his long journey. The weather was very hot, but Nur Muhammad thought that the sooner his precious letter was delivered the better, so that, by dint of riding almost each night and resting only in the hottest parts of the day, he found himself, by noon on the 3rd day, approaching the town which was his final destination. Not a soul was to be seen anywhere, and Nur Muhammad, stiff, dry, and thirsty and tired, looked longingly over the wall into the gardens, and marked the fountains, the green grass, and shady apricot orchards, and giant mulberry trees, and wished he were there. At length he reached the castle gates, and was at once admitted, as he was in the uniform of the king's bodyguard. The governor was resting, the soldier said, and could not see him until evening, so Nur Muhammad handed over his horse to the attendant and wandered down into the lovely gardens he had seen from the road, and sat down in the shade to rest himself. He flung himself on his back and watched the birds twittering and chattering in the trees above him. Through the branches he could see the great patches of sky where the kites wheeled and circled incessantly, with shrill whistling cries. The bees buzzed over the flowers with a soothing sound, and in a few minutes Nur Muhammad was fast asleep. Every day, through the heat of the afternoon, the governor and his wife also used to lie down for 2 or 3 hours in their own rooms, and so, for the matter of that, most people did in the palace. But the princess, like many other girls, was restless, and preferred to wander about the gardens rather than rest on a soft pile of cushions. What a torment her old stout attendants and servants sometimes thought her when she insisted on staying awake, making them chatter or do something when they could hardly keep their eyes open. Sometimes, however, the princess would pretend to go to sleep, and then, after all her women would gladly follow her example, she would get up and go out by herself, her veil hanging loosely about her. If she was discovered, her old hostess scolded her severely, but the princess only laughed and did the same thing the next time. This very afternoon the princess had left all her women asleep, and after trying in vain to amuse herself indoors, she had slipped out into the great garden and rambled about in all her favorite nooks and corners, feeling quite safe as there was not a creature to be seen. Suddenly, on turning the corner, she stopped in surprise, for before her lay a man fast asleep. In a hurry she had almost tripped over him, but there he was, a young man, tanned and dusty with travel, in the officer's uniform of the king's guard. One of the few faults of this lovely princess was a devouring curiosity, and she lived such an idle life that she had plenty of time to be curious. One of the folds of the letter Out of one of the folds of the young man's turban there peeped the corner of the letter. She wondered what the letter was, and whom it was for. She drew her veil a little closer and stole across on tiptoe, and caught hold of the corner of the letter. She pulled it a little, and just a little more. The great big seal came into view, which she saw to be her father's, and by the sight of it she paused for a moment, half ashamed of what she was doing. But the pleasure of taking a letter which was not meant for her was more than she could resist. In another moment it was in her hand. All at once she remembered that she could be death to the poor officer if he lost the letter, so that at all hazards she must put it back again. But this was not so easy, and moreover the letter in her hand burned with a longing to read it and see what was inside. She examined the seal. It was sticky with being exposed to the hot sun. With a very little effort it parted from the paper. The letter was open, and she read it, and this is what she had seen written. "Behead this messenger who brings this letter secretly and at once. Ask no questions." The girl grew pale. What a shame, she thought. She would not let this handsome young fellow be beheaded. How to prevent this was not quite clear at the moment. Some plan must be invented, and she wished herself to lock up where no one could interrupt her, and might easily happen in the garden. So she crept softly into her room and took a piece of paper and wrote upon it, "Marry the messenger who brings this letter to the princess openly at once. Ask no questions." And even contrived to work the seals off the original letter and to fix them to this, so that no one could tell, unless they examined it closely, that it had ever been opened. Then she slipped back, shaking with fear and excitement, to where the young officer lay still asleep, thrust the letter into the folds of his turban, and hurried back to her room. It was done. Later in the afternoon, Nur Muhammad woke, and making sure that the precious dispatch was still safe, went off to get ready for his audience with the governor. As soon as he was ushered into the presence, he took the letter from his turban and placed it in the governor's hands, according to orders. When he had read it, the governor was certainly a little astonished, but he was told in the letter to not ask questions, and he knew how to obey orders. He sent for his wife and told her to get the princess to be ready at once to be married. "Nonsense," said the wife. "What in the world do you mean?" "These are the king's commands," he answered. "Go and do as I bid you. The letter says at once, and ask no questions. The marriage, therefore, must take place this evening." In vain did his wife urge every objection, and the more she argued, the more determined was her husband. "I know how to obey orders," he said, "and these are plain as the nose on my face." So the princess was summoned, and somewhat to their surprise, she seemed to take the news very calmly. Next, Nur Muhammad was informed, and he was greatly startled, but of course he could be delighted at the great and unexpected honor with which he thought the king had done him. Then all the castle was turned upside down. When the news spread in town, that was turned upside down too. Everybody ran everywhere and tried to do everything at once, and in the middle of it all, the old governor went about with his hair standing on end, muttering something about obeying orders. And so the marriage was celebrated, and there was a great feast in the castle, and another in the soldiers' barracks, and illuminations all over town and in the beautiful gardens. And all the people declared that such a wonderful sight had never been seen, and talked about it till the end of their lives. The next day the governor dispatched the princess and her bridegroom to the king, with a troop of horsemen splendidly dressed, and he sent a mounted messenger on before them, with a letter giving the account of the marriage to the king. When the king got the governor's letter, he grew so red in the face that everyone thought he was going to have apoplexy. They were all very anxious to know what had happened, but he rushed off and locked himself in a room, where he ranted and raved until he was tired. Then, after a while, he began to think he had better make the best of it, especially as the old governor had been clever enough to send him back his letter, and the king was pretty sure that this was the princess's handwriting. He was fond of his daughter, and though she had behaved badly, he did not wish to cut her head off, and he did not want people to know the truth, as it would make him look foolish. In fact, the more he considered the matter, the more he felt that he would be wise to put a good face on it, and to let people suppose that he had really brought about this marriage of his own free will. So when the young couple arrived, the king received them with all state, and gave his son-in-law a province to govern. Nur Muhammad soon proved himself as able and honorable a governor as he was a brave soldier, and when the old king died, he became king in his place, and reigned long and happily. Nur Muhammad's mother lived for a long time in her son's palace, and died in peace. The princess, his wife, although she had got her husband by a trick, found that she could not trick him, and so she never tried, but busied herself in teaching her children and scolding her maids. As for the old hermit, no trace of him was ever discovered. But the cave is there, and the leaves lie thick in front of it until this day. I have used all the pauses I had to finish that story. So, we're going to get a break before I break. Be back in a few, hopefully. Okay. Well, the timer says the edge over, so I'm going to guess they are. Welcome back. I hope you had a good break. So there's 3 stories left. Most of them are a little bit shorter than the last one, and one is longer, so I'm going to go ahead and try to finish the book tonight. Which means I don't know what I'm going to do next week. Unless I just, take the night off or something and go do haunted houses or something. I don't know. Haunted houses are awfully people-y, and I've been getting a lot of crowd anxiety lately. In fact, I was having issues with it today. Oh. But people keep asking me to go outside, and there's people out there, and people freak out, I guess. Anyway. Our next fabulous fairy tale for this Friday night. The story of Wali the Simple-Hearted. Once upon a time there lived a poor old man whose name was Wali Gunjay, or Wali the Bald. He had no relations, but lived all by himself in a little mud hut some distance from any towns, and made his living by cutting grass in the jungle and selling it as fodder for horses. He only earned about 5 halfpence a day, but he was a simple old man and needed so little out of it that he saved up 1 halfpenny daily, and spent the rest upon food and clothing as he required. In this way he lived for many years, until one night he thought that he would count the money he had hidden away in the great earthen pot under the floor of his hut. So he set to work, and with much trouble he pulled the bag out of the floor, and sat gazing in astonishment at the heap of coins which had tumbled out of it. What should he do with all of them, he wondered. But he never thought of spending the money on himself, because he was content to pass the rest of his days as he had been doing for so long, and he really had no desire of any great comfort or luxury. At last he threw all the money into an old sack, which he pushed under his bed, then rolled in his ragged old blanket and went to sleep. Early next morning he staggered off with a sack of money to the shop of a jeweler whom he knew to be in town, and bargained with him for a little gold bracelet. With his carefully wrapped up in cotton waistband, he went to the house of a rich friend, who was a traveling merchant and used to wander about with his camels and merchandise through many countries. Wali was lucky enough to find him at home, so he sat down, and after a little talk, he asked the merchant who was the most virtuous and beautiful lady he had ever met with. The merchant replied that the Princess of Kazakhstan was renowned everywhere for her beauty of a person, as well as for the kindness and generosity of her disposition. "Well," said Wali, "next time you go that way, give her this little bracelet, with the respectful compliments of one who admires virtue far more than he desires wealth." With that, he pulled the bracelet from his waistband and handed it to his friend. The merchant was naturally astonished, but said nothing, and made no objection to carrying out his friend's plan. Time passed by, and at length the merchant arrived in the course of his travels to the capital of Kazakhstan. As soon as he had the opportunity, he presented himself at the palace, and sent in the bracelet, neatly packed in a little perfumed box provided by himself, giving at the same time the message entrusted to him by Wali. The princess could not think who could have bestowed this present on her, but she bade her servant to tell the merchant that if he would return after he had finished his business in the room, she would give him her reply. In a few days, therefore, the merchant came back and received from the princess a return present in the shape of a camel-load of rich silks, besides a present of money for himself. With these he set out on his journey. Some months later he got home again from his journeyings and proceeded to take Wali the princess's present. Great was the perplexity of the good man to find a camel-load of silks tumbled at his door. What was he to do with these costly things? But presently, after much thought, he begged the merchant to consider whether he did not know some young prince to whom such treasures might be useful. Of course, cried the merchants, greatly amused. From Delhi to Baghdad, and from Constantinople to Lucknow, I know them all, and there lives none worthier than the gallant and wealthy young prince of Nakabad. Very well, then, take the silks to him, with the blessing of an old man, said Wali Dad, much relieved to be rid of them. So the next time the merchants journeyed that way, he carried the silks with him, and in due course he arrived at Nekabad and sought an audience with the prince. When he was shown into the presence of he produced the beautiful gift of silks that Wali Dad had sent, and begged the young man to accept them as a humble tribute of his worth and greatness. The prince was much touched by the generosity of the giver, and ordered, as a return present, 12 of the finest breed of horses for which his country was famous to be delivered over to the merchant, who also, before he took his leave, gave a magnificent reward for his services. As before, the merchant at last arrived at home, and next day he set out to Wali Dad's house with the 12 horses. When the old man saw them coming in the distance, he said to himself, "What luck! A troop of horses is coming. They will want quantities of grass, and I shall set all I have without having to drag to market." Thereupon he rushed off and cut grass as fast as he could. When he got back with as much grass as he could possibly carry, he was greatly discomfited to find out that the horses were all for himself. At first he could not think what to do with them, but after a little, a brilliant idea struck him. He gave 2 to the merchant, and begged him to take the rest to the Princess of Kazakhstan, who was clearly the fittest person to possess such beautiful animals. The merchant departed, laughing, but true to his old friend's request, he took the horses with him on his next journey, and eventually presented them safely to the princess. This time the princess sent for the merchant and questioned him about the giver. Now the merchant was usually a most honest man, but he did not quite like to describe Wali Dad in his true light as an old man whose income was 5 halfpence a day, and who hardly had clothes to cover him. So he told her that his friend had heard stories of her beauty and goodness, and had longed to lay the best he had at her feet. The princess then took her father into her confidence, and begged him to advise her what courtesy she might return to one who persisted in making such presents. "Well," said the king, "you cannot refuse them, so the best thing you can do is to send this unknown friend at once a present so magnificent that he is not likely to be able to send you anything better, and so will be ashamed to send you anything at all." Then he ordered that, in place of each of the 10 horses, 2 mules laden with silver should be returned by her. Thus, in a few hours, the merchant found himself in charge of a splendid caravan, and he had to hire a number of armed men to defend it on the road against robbers, and he was glad indeed to find himself back again in Wali Dad's hut. "Well now," cried Wali Dad as he viewed the wealth laid at his door, "I can well repay this kind prince for the magnificent present of the horses, but to be sure you have put in great expenses. Still, if you will accept 6 mules and their loads will take the rest straight to Nakabad, I will thank you heartily." The merchant felt handsomely repaid for his trouble, and wondered greatly how the matter would turn out. So he made no difficulty about it, and as soon as he could get things ready, set out for Nekabad with his new and princely gift. This time the prince, too, was embarrassed, and questioned the merchant closely. The merchant felt that his credit was at stake, and so, whilst inwardly determining that he should not carry the joke on any further, he could not help describing Wali Dad in such glowing terms that the old man would never have known himself had he heard them. The prince, like the king of Kazakhstan, determined that he would send in return a gift that would be truly royal, and which would perhaps prevent the unknown giver sending him any more. So he made up a caravan of 20 splendid horses, caparisoned with gold-embroidered cloth, with fine Morocco sandals and silver bridles and stirrups. Also 20 camels of the best breed, which had the speed of racehorses and could swing along at the trot all day without getting tired. And lastly 20 elephants with magnificent silver howdahs and coverings of silk embroidered with pearls. To take care of these animals, the merchant hired a little army of men, and a troop made a great show as they traveled along. When Wali Dad from the distance saw a cloud of dust which the caravan made, and the glitter of its appointments, he said to himself, "By Allah, there's a grand crowd coming. Elephants, too! Grass will be selling well today! And with that, he hurried off to the jungle and cut grass as fast as he could. As soon as he got back, he found the caravan had stopped at his door, and the merchant was waiting, a little anxiously, to tell him the news and to congratulate him on his riches. "Riches?" cried Wali. "What has an old man like me with one foot in the grave to do with riches? That beautiful princess, now. She'd be the one to enjoy all these fine things. Do you take for yourself 2 horses, 2 camels, and 2 elephants with all their trappings, and present the rest to her." The merchant at first objected to these remarks, and pointed out to Wali that he was beginning to feel little embassies a little awkward. Of course, he found himself richly repaid, so far as expenses went, but he still did not like going so often, and he was getting nervous. At length, however, he consented to go once more, but he promised himself never to embark on another such enterprise. So a few days' rest, the caravan started off once more to Kazakhstan. The moment the king of Kazakhstan saw the gorgeous train of men and beasts entering his palace courtyard, he was so amazed he hurried down in person to inquire about it, and became dumb when he heard that all these were a present from the princely Wali and were for the princess, his daughter. He went off hastily to her apartments and said to her, "I tell you what it is, my dear. That man wants to marry you. That is the meaning of all these presents. There is nothing for it but to go and pay him a visit in person. You must be a man of immense wealth, and is so devoted to you, perhaps you might do worse than marry him." The princess agreed with all that her father said, and orders were issued for vast numbers of elephants, camels, and gorgeous tents and flags, and litters for the ladies and horses for the men to be prepared without delay, as the king and the princess were going to pay a visit to the great and magnificent Prince Wali. The merchant, the king declared, was to guide the party. The feelings of the poor merchant in the sore dilemma can hardly be imagined. Willingly he would have run away, but he was treated with such hospitality as Walizad's representative that he hardly got an instant's real peace, and never had opportunity to slip him away. In fact, after a few days, despair possessed him to such a degree that he made up his mind that all that happened was fate, and that escape was impossible. But he hoped devoutly to turn some fortune that would reveal to him a way of the difficulties which he had, with the best intentions, drawn upon himself. On the 7th day they all started, amidst thunderous salutes from the ramparts of the city, and much dust and cheering and blaring of trumpets. Day after day they moved on, and every day the poor merchant fell more ill and miserable. He wondered what kind of death the king would invent for him, and went almost as much torture as he lay awake the whole of every night, thinking of his situation, as he would have suffered if the king's executioners were already setting work upon his neck. At last they were only a day's march from Wali Dodd's little mud home. Here a great encampment was made, and the merchant was sent on to tell Wali Dodd that the king and princess of Kazakhstan had arrived and were seeking an interview. When the merchant arrived, he found the poor old man eating his evening meal of onions and dry bread, and when he told him of all that had happened, he had not the heart to proceed to load him with the reproaches which rose to his tongue. For Wali Dodd was overwhelmed with grief and shame for himself, for his friend, and for the name of honor of the princess, and he wept and plucked at his beard and groaned quite piteously. With tears he begged the merchant to detain them for one day by any kind of excuse he could think of, and to come in the morning to discuss what they should do. As soon as the merchant was gone, Wali Dodd made up his mind that there was only one honorable way out of the shame and distress that had created by his foolishness, and that was to kill himself. So, without stopping to ask for anyone's advice, he went off in the middle of the night to a place where the river wound along at the base of a steep, rocky cliffs of great height, and determined to throw himself down and put an end to his life. When he got to the place, he drew back a few breaths and took a little run. At the very edge of that grateful black gulf he stopped short. He could not do it. From below, unseen in the blackness and the deep night shadows, the water roared and boiled around jagged rocks. He could picture the place as he knew it, only 10 times more pitiless and foreboding in the visionless darkness. The wind soughed through the gorge with fearsome sighs and rustlings and whisperings. and the bushes and grasses that grew on the ledges of the cliff seemed to him like living creatures that danced and beckoned, shadowing him as things. An owl laughed, "Ooh, ooh," almost in his face, as he peered over the edge of the gulf. The old man threw himself back in a perspiration of horror. He was afraid. He drew back shuddering and covering his face with his hands and wept aloud. Presently he was aware of a gentle radiance that shed itself before him. Surely the morning was not already coming to hasten and reveal his disgrace. He took his hands from before his face, and before him saw two lovely beings whom his instinct told him were not mortal, but were fairies from paradise. "Why do you weep, old man?" said one, in a voice clear and as musical as bubble. "I weep for shame." "What do you do here?" questioned the other. "I came here to die," said Wali Dodd, and as they questioned him, he confessed all his story. Then he first stepped forward and laid his hand upon the shoulder, and Wali Dodd began to feel that something strange, what he did not know, was happening to him. His old cotton rags of clothes were changed to the beautiful linens and embroidered cloth. On his hard, bare feet were warm, soft shoes, and on his head a great jeweled turban. Round his neck there lay a heavy golden chain, and his little old bent sickle, which he cut grass with, which hung from his waistband, had turned into a gorgeous scimitar, whose ivory hilt gleamed in the pale light like snow in the moonlight. As he stood there wondering, like a man in a dream, the other Peri waved her hand and bade him turn and see. And lo, before him a noble gateway stood open. Up in an avenue, giant trees placed the Peris led him, dumb with amazement. At the end of the avenue, on the very spot where his hut had stood, a gorgeous palace appeared. It blazed with a myriad of lights, and its great porticos and verandas were occupied by hurrying servants. Guards paced to and fro and saluted him respectfully as he drew near. Along mossy walks and through sweepy, grassy lawns were fountains playing and flowers scented the air. Wali Dodd stood stunned and helpless. "Fear not," said one of the fairies. "Go to your house and learn that God rewards the simple-hearted." With these words, they both disappeared and left him. He walked on, thinking still that he must be dreaming. Very soon he retired to rest in a splendid room, far grander than anything he had ever dreamed of. When morning dawned, he awoke, and found that the palace, and himself, and his servants were all real, and that he was not dreaming after all. If he was dumbfounded, the merchant, who was ushered into his presence soon after sunrise, was more so. He told Wali Dodd he had not slept all night. By the first streak of daylight he started out to seek his old friend. And what a search he had had! A great stretch of wild jungle country had, in the night, changed into parks and gardens, and if it had not been for some of Wali Dodd's new servants who found him and brought him to the palace, he would have fled away under the impression that trouble had been sent him crazy, and that was only his imagination. Then Wali Dodd told the merchant all that had happened. By his advice he sent the invitation to the king and princes of Kazakhstan to come and be his guests, together with a retinue of servants, down to the very humblest in the camp. For 3 nights and days the great feast was held in honor of the royal guests, and every evening the king and his nobles were served on golden plates from golden cups, and the smaller people in silver plates and silver cups, and each evening each guest was requested to keep the plates and cups they had used as a remembrance of the occasion. Never had anything so splendid been seen. Besides the great dinners, there were all sports and hunting, and dances and amusements of all sorts. On the 4th day the king of Kazakhstan took his host aside, and asked him whether it was true, as he suspected, that he wished to marry his daughter. But Wali Dodd, after thanking him very much for the compliment, said that he had never dreamed of so great an honor, and that he was far too old and ugly for so fair a lady. But he begged the king to stay with him until he could send for the Prince of Nekabad, who was a most excellent, brave, and honorable young man, and who would surely be delighted to try to win the hand of a beautiful princess. The king agreed, and Wali Dodd sent the merchant to Nekabad with a number of attendants, and with such handsome presents that the prince came at once, fell head over ears in love with the princess, and married her at Wali Dodd's palace amidst the fresh outbursts of rejoicings. And now the king of Kaistan and the prince and princess of Nakabad each went back to their own country, and Wali lived to a good old age, befriending all who were in trouble and preserving in his prosperity the simple-hearted, generous nature that he had when he was only Wali Gunjay, the grass cutter. I don't know why, but I'm drooling a lot. At least I'm producing a lot of saliva, and it's making it where I have to pause and swallow every now and then. But anyway, our fourth wonderful fairy tale for this Friday evening. Tale of a Tortoise and of a Mischievous Monkey. Once upon a time there was a country where the rivers were larger and the forests deeper than anywhere else. Hardly any men came there, and the wild creatures had it all to themselves, and used to play all sorts of strange games with each other. The great trees chained one to the other by thick flowering plants with bright scarlet or yellow blossoms were famous hiding places for the monkeys, who could wait unseen till a puma or an elephant passed by, and then jump on their backs and go for a ride, swinging themselves up by the creepers when they had had enough. Near the river huge tortoises were to be found, and through their eyes the tortoise seemed a dull and slow thing. It was wonderful to think how clever they were, and how often they outwitted many of their livelier friends. There was one tortoise in particular that always managed to get the better of everybody, and many were the tales told in the forest of his great deeds. They began when he was quite young, and tired of staying at home with his father and mother. He left them one day and walked off in search of adventures. In a wide open space surrounded by trees, he met with an elephant who was having his supper before taking his evening bath in the river which ran close by. "Let us see who is the strongest," said the young tortoise, marching up to the elephant. "Very well," replied the elephant, much amused at the impertinence of the little creature. "When would you like the trial to be?" "In an hour's time," said the "I have some business to do first," answered the tortoise, and he hastened away as fast as his short legs could carry him. In a pool of the river a whale was resting, blowing water into the air and making a lovely fountain. The tortoise, however, was too young and too busy to admire such things, and he told the whale to stop as he wanted to speak to him. "Would you like to try which of us are stronger?" he said. The whale looked at him, then sent up another fountain, and answered, "Yes, certainly. When do you wish to begin? I am quite ready." "Then give me one of your longest bones and fasten it to my leg. When I give the signal, you must pull, and we will see which can pull the hardest." "Very good," replied the whale, and he took out one of his bones and passed it to the tortoise. The tortoise picked up the end of the bone with his mouth and went back to the elephant. "I will fasten this to your leg," said he, "in the same way it is fastened to mine, and we must pull as hard as we can, and we will soon see which is the stronger." So he wound it carefully around the elephant's leg, and tied it in a firm knot. "No!" cried he, plunging into the thick bush behind him. The whale tugged at one end, and the elephant tugged the other, and neither had any idea that it was not the tortoise that was foe. When the whale pulled hardest, the elephant was dragged into the water, and when the elephant pulled the hardest, the whale was hauled into the land. And when they were evenly matched, and the battle was a hard one. At last they were tired, and the tortoise, who was watching, saw that they could play no more. He crept from his hiding place and dipped himself into the river. He went to the elephant and said, "I see you are really stronger than I thought. Suppose we give it up for today." Then he dried himself on some moss and went to the whale and said, "I see you are really stronger than I thought. Suppose we give it up for today." Two adversaries were only too glad to be allowed to rest, and believed to the end of their days, after all, the tortoise was stronger than either of them. A day or two later, the young tortoise was taking a stroll when he met a fox, and stopped to speak to him. Let us try, he said in a careless manner. See which of us can lie buried in the ground during 7 years. I shall be delighted, answered the fox. Only I would rather that you began. It's all the same to me, said the tortoise. If you come round this way tomorrow, you will see that I've fulfilled my part of the bargain. So he looked about for a suitable place and found a convenient hole about a foot from an orange tree. He crept into it, and next morning the fox leaped on the earth round him and promised to feed him every day with fresh fruit. The fox was The fox so far kept his word that each morning when the sun rose he appeared to ask the tortoise how he was getting on. Oh, very well, but I wish you would give me some fruit, replied he. Alas, the fruit is not ripe enough to eat yet, answered the fox, who hoped the tortoise would die of hunger long before the 7 years were over. Oh dear, I am so hungry, answered the tortoise. I am sure you must be, but it will be all right tomorrow, said the fox, trotting off, not knowing that the oranges dropped down the hollow trunk straight into the tortoise's hole, and that he had as many as he could possibly eat. So the 7 years went by. When the tortoise came out of his hole, he was as fat as ever. Now it was the fox's turn, and he chose his hole, and the tortoise heaped the earth round, promising to return every day or two with a nice young bird for his dinner. How are you getting on? He would cheerfully ask when he paid his visits. Oh, all right. I wish you had brought a bird with you, answered the fox. I've been so unlucky I've never been able to catch one, replied the tortoise. However, I shall be more fortunate tomorrow, I'm sure. But not many tomorrows after, when the tortoise arrived with the usual question. How will you getting on? He received no answer, for the fox was lying in his hole, quite still, dead from hunger. By this time the tortoise was grown up, and was looking up throughout the forest for a person to be feared for his strength and wisdom. But he was not considered a very swift runner, until an adventure with a deer added to his fame. One day, when he was basking in the sun, a stag passed by and stopped for a little conversation. Would you care to see which of us can run fastest? Asked the tortoise. After some talk, the stag thought the question so silly that he only shrugged his shoulders. Of course, the victor would have the right to kill the other, went on the tortoise. Oh, on that condition I agree, answered the deer, but I'm afraid you are a dead man. It is no use trying to frighten me, replied the tortoise, but I should like 3 days for training, and then I shall be ready to start when the sun strikes on the big tree at the edge of the great clearing. First thing the tortoise did was to call his brothers and his cousins together, and he posed them very carefully under ferns along the way in a great clearing, making a sort of ladder which stretched for many miles. This done to his satisfaction, he went back to the starting place. The stag was quite punctual, and as soon as the sun's rays struck the trunk of the tree, the stag started off, and was soon far out of sight of the tortoise. Every now and then he would turn his head as he ran and call out, How are you getting on? And the tortoise, who happened to be nearest at the moment, would answer, All right, I'm close up to you. Full of astonishment, the stag would redouble his efforts, but it was no use. Each time he asked, Are you there? An answer would come, Yes, of course. Where else should I be? And as the stag ran and ran and ran till he could run no more, he dropped down dead on the grass. And the tortoise, when he thinks about it, laughs still. But the tortoise was not the only creature of whose trick stories were told in the forest. There was a famous monkey who was just as clever and more mischievous, because he was so much quicker on his feet and with his hands. It was quite impossible to catch him and give him the thrashing he so often deserved, for he just swung himself up to a tree and laughed at the angry victim who was sitting below. Sometimes, however, the inhabitants of the forest were so foolish as to provoke him, and then they got the worst of it. This was what happened to the barber when the monkey visited one morning, saying he wished to be shaved. The barber bowed politely to his customer, and begged him to be seated, and tied a large cloth round his neck, and rubbed his chin with soap. But instead of cutting off his beard, the barber made a snip at the end of his tail. There was only little bits, and the monkey started up more and more in rage. "Give me back the end of my tail!" he roared, "or I will take one of your razors! Or I will take one of your razors!" The barber refused to give back the missing piece, so the monkey caught up a razor from the table and ran away with it. And knowing the forest could be shaved for days, so there was not another to be got for miles and miles. As he was making his way to his own peculiar palm tree, where its coconuts grew, which were so useful for pelting passers-by, he met a woman who was scaling a fish with a bit of wood, for in this side of the forest few people lived in huts near the river. "That must be hard work," said the monkey, stopping to look. "Try my knife. You will get on quicker." And he handed her the razor as he spoke. A few days later he came back and rapped at the door of the hut. "I have called for my razor," he said when the woman appeared. "I have lost it," she answered. "If you don't give it to me at once, I'll take your sardine," replied the monkey, who did not believe her. The woman protested that she had not got the knife, so he took the sardine and ran off. A little further he saw a baker who was standing in the door eating one of his loaves. "That must be rather dry," said the monkey. "Try my fish." The man did not need to tell him twice. A few days later the monkey stopped by the baker's hut. "I've called for that fish," he said. "That fish? But I've eaten it," said the baker in dismay. "If you have eaten it, I shall take this barrel of meal in exchange," replied the monkey, and he walked off with the barrel under his arm. As he went on, he saw a woman with a little group of girls around her, teaching them how to dress hair. "Here is something to make cakes for the children," he said, putting down the barrel, which by this time he found rather heavy. The children were delighted and ran directly to make some flat stones to bake their cakes on, and when they had made them and eaten them, they thought they had never tasted anything so nice. Indeed, when they saw the monkey approaching not long after, they rushed to meet him, hoping that he was bringing some more presents. But he took no notice of their questions, and he only said to the mother, "I have called for my barrel of meal." "Why, you gave it to me to make cakes of," cried the mother. "If you can't get my barrel of meal, I shall take one of your children," answered the monkey. "I'm in want of somebody who can bake my bread when I get tired of fruit, and who knows how to make a coconut cakes." "Oh, leave my child. I will find you another barrel of meal," wept the mother. "I don't want another barrel. I want that one," answered the monkey sternly. And as the woman stood wringing her hands, he caught up the little girl that was the prettiest and took her to his home in the palm tree. She never went back to the hut, but on the whole she was not much to be pitied, for monkeys are nearly as good as children to play with, and they taught her how to swing and to climb and to fly from tree to tree, and anyone else knew, which was a great deal. Now the monkey's irksome tricks had made him the enemies in the forest, but no one hated him as much as the puma. The cause of their quarrel was known only to themselves, but everybody was aware of the fact, and they took care to be out of the way when there was any chance of these two meeting. Often and often the puma had laid traps for the monkey, which he felt sure his foe would not escape, and the monkey would pretend that he saw nothing, and rejoice the hidden puma's heart by steering him walk straight into the snare. And lo, a loud laugh would be heard, and the monkey's grinning face would peer out of a mass of creepers and disappear before his foe could catch him. The state of things had gone on for quite a while, when at last came the season such as the oldest parrot in the forest could never remember. Instead of 200 or 300 inches of rain, which they were all accustomed to, month after month passed without a cloud, and the rivers and the springs dried up until there was only one small pool left for everyone to drink from. There was not an animal for miles around that did not grieve over the shocking condition of affairs, not one at least, except for the puma. His only thought for years was how to get the monkey into his power, and this time he managed his chance had really arrived. He would hide himself in a thicket, and when the monkey came down to drink, and he must come, the puma would seize out and spring out and seize him. Yes, on this occasion there would be no escape. And no more there would be if the puma had had a greater patience, but in excitement he moved a little too soon. The monkey, who was stooping to drink, heard a rustling, and turning caught a glimpse of the two yellow, murderous eyes. With a mighty spring he grasped a creeper which was hanging above him, and landed himself on the branch of a tree, feeling the breath of the puma on his feet as the animal bounded from cover. Never had the monkey been so near death, and it was some time before he recovered enough courage to venture to the ground again. Up there in the shelter of the trees, he began to turn over in his head plans for escaping the snares of the puma, and at length chance helped him. Peeping down at the earth, he saw a man coming along the path, carrying on his head a large gourd filled with honey. He waited till the man was just underneath the tree, and then he hung from a bough and caught the gourd while the man looked up wondering, for he was no tree climber. When the monkey rubbed the honey all over himself, and a quantity of leaves from a creeper that was hanging close by, he stuck them all together with the honey, so that he looked like a walking bush. This finished, he ran to the pool to see the result, and quite pleased with himself, set out in search of adventures. Soon the report went through the forest that a new animal had appeared from no one knew where, and that when someone had asked his name, the strange creature had answered that he was Jack-in-the-Green. Thanks to this, the monkey was allowed to drink at the pool as often as he liked, for neither beast nor bird had the faintest notion who he was. And if they made any inquiries, the only answer they got was that the water in which he drank deeply had turned his hair into leaves, so that they all knew what would happen in case they became too greedy. By and by, the great rains began again, and the rivers and streams filled up, and there was no need for him to go back to the pool near the home of his enemy, the puma, as there was a large number of places for him to choose from. So one night, when everything was still and silent, and even the chattering parrots were asleep on one leg, the monkey stole down softly from his perch, and washed off the honey and the leaves, and came back out of his bath with his own proper skin. On his way to breakfast he met a rabbit, and stopped to talk. "I'm feeling rather dull," he remarked. "I think it would do me no good to hunt for a while. What do you say?" "Oh, I'm quite willing," answered the rabbit, proud of being spoken to by such a large creature. "But the question, what shall we hunt?" "There's no credit in going after an elephant or a tiger," replied the monkey, stroking his chin. "They are so big they could possibly not get out of our way. It shows much more skill to catch a small thing that can hide itself in a moment behind a leaf. I'll tell you what, suppose I hunt butterflies, and you, serpents." The rabbit, who was young and without experience, was delighted with this idea, so they both set out on various ways. The monkey quietly climbed on the nearest tree and ate fruit most of the day, while the rabbit tried himself to death poking his nose into dry heaps of leaves he saw, hoping to find a serpent among them. Luckily for himself, the serpents were all away for the afternoon, at the meeting of their own, for there is nothing a serpent likes so well as dinner off a nice plump rabbit. But as it was, the dried leaves were all empty, and the rabbit at last fell asleep where he was. Then the monkey, who had been watching him, fell down and pulled his ears, so the rage of the rabbit vowed vengeance. It was not easy to catch the monkey off guard, and the rabbit waited a long time before an opportunity arrived. One day, Jack-in-the-Green was sitting on a stone, wondering what he should do next, and the rabbit crept up softly behind him and gave his tail a sharp pull. The monkey gave a shriek of pain and darted up into a tree, but when he saw that it was only the rabbit who dared to insult him, he chattered so fast at his anger and looked so fierce that the rabbit fled to the nearest hole and stayed there for several days, trembling with fright. So after this adventure, the monkey went away into another part of the country, right on the outskirts of the forest, where there was a beautiful garden of oranges hanging ripe from the trees. This garden was a favorite place for the birds of all kinds, hoping to secure an orange for dinner. In order to frighten the birds away and keep a little fruit for himself, the master had fastened a waxen figure to one of the boughs. Now the monkey, who was as fond as oranges of any of the birds, and when he saw the man standing in a tree where the largest and sweetest oranges grew, he spoke to him at once. "You man," he said rudely, "throw me down a big orange up there, or I will throw a stone at you." The wax figure took no notice of his request, so the monkey, who was easily made angry, picked up a stone and flung it with all his force. But instead of falling to the ground, the stone stuck to the soft wax. At this moment, the breeze shook the tree, and an orange on which the monkey had his heart set on dropped from the bough. He picked it up and ate it every bit, including the rind, and it was so good he thought he should like another. So he called again to the wax figure to throw him an orange, and as the figure did not move, he hurled another stone, which stuck in the wax as the first one had done. Seeing that the man was quite indifferent to stones, the monkey grew more angry still, and climbing the tree hastily, gave the figure a violent kick. But, like the two stones, his leg remained stuck in the wax, and was held fast. "Let me go at once, or I will give you another kick!" he cried, suiting the action with a word. This time his foot also remained in the grasp of the man. Not knowing what to do, the monkey hit out, first with one hand and then with the other. When he found that he was literally bound hand and foot, he became so mad with anger and terror, and his voice... He became so mad with anger and terror that in his struggles he fell to the ground, dragging the figure with him. This freed his hands and feet, but besides the shock of the fall, they had tumbled into a bed of thorns. He limped away broken and bruised, and groaning loudly. For when monkeys are hurt, they take pains that everybody should know it. It was a long time before Jack was as well to go about again, but when he did, he had an encounter with his old enemy, the puma, and this was how it came about. One day the puma invited his friend the stag to go with him and see a comrade who was famous for the good milk he got from his cows. The stag, who loved milk, gladly accepted the invitation, and when the sun began to get a little low, the two started on their walk. On the way they arrived on the banks of a river, and as there were no bridges in those days, it was necessary to swim across. The stag was not fond of swimming, and began to say that he was tired, and though after all that it was not worth going so far to get milk, and that he would return home. But the puma easily saw through his excuses and laughed at him. "The river is not deep at all," he said. "Why will you not come over? Why, you will never be off your feet. Come, pluck up your courage, and follow me." The stag was afraid of the river. Still, he was as much more afraid of being laughed at, and he plunged in after the puma, but in an instant the current had swept him away, and if it had not borne him by accident up a shallow place on the opposite side, where he managed to scramble up the bank, he certainly would have been drowned. As it was, he scrambled out, shaking in terror, and found the puma waiting for him. "You had a narrow escape that time," said the puma. After resting for a few minutes, to let the stag recover from its fright, they went on the way till they came to a grove of bananas. "Those look very good," observed the puma with a longing glance, "and I'm sure you must be hungry, friend stag. Suppose you were to climb the tree and get some. You shall eat the green ones, they are the best and sweetest, and you can throw the yellow ones down to me, if they dare say they will do quite well." The stag did as he was bid, though, not being used to climbing, it gave him some trouble and sore knees, and besides, his horns were continually getting tangled in the creepers. What was worse, when he had tasted the bananas, he found them not at all to his liking, and he threw them all down, green and yellow alike, and let the puma have his choice. Oh, what a dinner he made! And when he was quite done, they set forth once more. The path lay through a field of maize, where several men were working, and as they came up to them, the puma whispered, "Go in front, friend stag, and say, 'Bad luck to all workers.'" The stag obeyed, but the men were hot and tired, and did not think it was a good joke. So they set their dogs at him, and he was obliged to run away as fast as he could. "I hope your industry will be rewarded as it deserves," said the puma as he passed along. The men were pleased, and offered him some of their maize to eat. By and by, the puma saw a small snake, with a beautiful shining skin, lying coiled up at the foot of a tree. "What a lovely bracelet that would make for your daughter, friend stag," he said. The stag stooped and picked up the snake, which bit him, and he turned angrily to the puma. "Why did you not tell me it would bite?" he asked. "Is it my fault that you were an idiot?" replied the puma. At last they reached the journey's end, but by this time it was late, and the puma's comrade was ready for bed, so they slung their hammocks in convenient places and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night the puma rose softly and stole out of the door to the sheepfold. He killed and ate the fattest sheep he could, and taking a bowl full of its blood, he sprinkled the sleeping stag with it. This done, he returned to bed. In the morning, the shepherd went as usual to his sheep out of the fold, and found one of them missing. He thought directly of the puma, and ran to accuse him of having eaten the sheep. "Ay, my good man, what had put it in your head to think of such a thing? Have I got any blood about him? If anyone has eaten the sheep, it must be my friend the stag." Then the shepherd went to examine the sleeping stag, and, of course, he saw the blood. "Ah, I will teach you to steal," cried he, and he hit the stag with such a blow on his skull that he died in a moment. The noise awakened the comrade above, and when he came downstairs, the puma greeted him with joy, and begged he might have some of the famous milk as soon as possible, for he was very thirsty. A large bucket was set before the puma directly, and he drank it to the last drop, and then took leave. On his way home, he met the monkey. "Are you fond of milk?" asked he. "I know a place where you will get it very nice. I will show it if you like." The monkey knew the puma was not so good-natured for nothing, but he felt quite able to take care of himself, so he said he would have much pleasure in accompanying his friend. So they soon reached the same river, and before the puma remarked, "Friend monkey, you will find it very shallow. There is no cause for fear. Jump it, and I will follow." "Do you think you have the stag to deal with?" asked the monkey, laughing. "I should prefer to follow. If not, I shall go no further." The puma understood that it was useless trying to make the monkey do as he wished, so he chose a shallow place and began to swim across. The monkey waited until the puma had got to the middle. Then he gave a great spring and jumped on his back, knowing quite well that the puma would be afraid to shake him off, lest he should sweep away in deep water. So in this manner they reached the bank. The banana grove was not too far distant, and here the puma thought he would pay the friend monkey for forcing him out to carry him across the river. "Friend monkey, look at the fine bananas," he cried. "You are fond of climbing. Suppose you run up and throw me down a few. You can eat the green ones, which are the nicest, and I will be content with a yellow." "Very well," answered the monkey, swinging himself up, but he ate all the yellow ones himself and threw down only the green ones. The puma was furious and cried out, "I will punch your head for that." But the monkey only answered, "If you're going to talk such nonsense, I won't walk with you." And the puma was silent. In a few minutes more they arrived at the field where the men were reaping the maize. The puma remarked, as he had done before, "Friend monkey, if you wish to please these men, just go and say bad luck to all workers." "Very well," replied the monkey, but instead he nodded and smiled and said, "I hope your industry may be rewarded as it deserves." The men thanked him heartily and let him pass, and the puma followed behind him. Further along the path they saw the shining snake in the moss. What a lovely necklace for your daughter," said the puma. "Pick it up and take it with you." "You are very kind, but I will leave it for you," answered the monkey, and nothing more was said about the snake. Not long after this they reached the comrade's house, and found him just ready to go to bed. So without stopping to talk, the guests slung their hammocks, and the monkey taking care to places high that no one could get to him. Besides, he thought it would be more prudent to not fall asleep, so he only lay still and snored loudly. When it was quite dark, and no sound was to be heard, the puma crept out of the sheepfold and killed a sheep, and carried back a bowl full of its blood with which to sprinkle the monkey. But the monkey, who had been watching from the corner of his eye, waited until the puma drew near, and with a violent kick upset the bowl all over the puma himself. When the puma saw what had happened, he turned in a great hurry to leave the house, but before he could do so, he saw the shepherd coming, and hastily lay down again. "This is the second time I've lost a sheep," said the man to the monkey. "It would be worse for the thief if I catch him, I can tell you." The monkey did not answer, but silently pointed to the puma, who was pretending to be asleep. The shepherd stooped and saw the blood and cried out, "Ah, so it is you! Then take that!" And with a stick he gave the puma such a blow on the head that he died then and there. Then the monkey got up and went to the dairy, and drank all the milk he could find. Afterwards he returned home and married, and that was the last we heard of him. There's only one story left. We're going to hit ads. So instead of waiting for those, I'm going to get them started so we can come back and do the final story. So, back in a few. I had a feeling I knew it was Groucho Marx. I couldn't think of what club it was, though. Okay. That's it. The Groucho Marx remark would be known, but as I said, I couldn't think of being a farce, but... Okay, well... For those kind of few who are remaining, we have one last story for this book. Can you believe it? 7 sessions and we've gotten through a full book. So our final story for the Brown Fairy book on this fabulous Friday Night of Fairy Tales: The Knights of the Fish. Once upon a time there lived an old cobbler who worked very hard at his trade from morning till night, and scarcely gave himself a moment to eat. But, industrious as he was, he could hardly buy bread and cheese for himself and his wife, and they grew thinner and thinner daily. For a long time they pretended to each other that they had no appetite, and that a few blackberries from the hedges were a great deal nicer than a good strong bowl of soup. But at length there came a day when the cobbler could bear it no longer, and he threw away his last, and borrowed a rod from his neighbor, and went out to fish. Now the cobbler was patient about fishing, as he had been cobbling. From dawn to dark he stood on the banks of the little stream, without hooking anything better than an eel or a few old shoes, and that he, clever as he was, felt were not worth mending. At length his patience began to give way, and as he was undressing one night he said to himself, "I will give it one more chance. If I don't catch a fish tomorrow, I'll go and hang myself." He had not cast his line for 10 minutes the next morning before he drew from the river the most beautiful fish he had ever seen in his life. But he nearly fell into the water from surprise when the fish began to speak to him in a small, squeaky voice. "Take me back to your hut and cook me. Cut me up and sprinkle me over with pepper and salt. Give 2 pieces to your wife and bury 2 more in the garden." The cobbler did not know what to make of these strange words, but he was wiser than many people, and when he did not understand, he thought it was well to obey. His children wanted to eat all the fish themselves, and begged their father to tell them what to do with the pieces he had set outside. But the cobbler only laughed and told them it was no business of theirs. And when they were safe in bed, he stole out and buried 2 pieces in the garden. By and by, 2 babies, exactly alike, lay in a cradle, and in the garden were 2 tall plants, with 2 brilliant shields on top. Years passed away, and the babies were almost men. They were tired of living quietly at home, and being mistaken for each other by everybody they saw, and determined to set off in different directions to seek their own adventures. So, one fine morning, the 2 brothers left the hut, and walked together to the place where the great road divided. There they embraced and parted, promising that if anything remarkable had happened to the other, they would return to the crossroads and wait till his brother came. The youth who took the path that ran eastwards arrived presently at the large city, where he found everybody standing at the doors, wringing their hands, and weeping bitterly. "What's the matter?" he asked, pausing and looking around, and the man replied in a faltering voice that each year a beautiful girl was chosen by lot to be offered to a dreadful fiery dragon, who had a mother even worse than himself, and this year the lot had fallen on their peerless princess. "But where is the princess?" said the young man once more. Again the man answered him, "She is standing under a tree a mile away, waiting for the dragon." This time the Knight of the Fish did not stop to hear more, but ran off as fast as he could, and found the princess bathed in tears and trembling from head to foot. She turned as she heard the sound of his sword, and removed her handkerchief from her eyes. "Fly!" she cried. "Fly while you still can, before that monster sees you." She said it, and she meant it, yet when he had turned his back she felt more forsaken than ever. But in reality it was not more than a few minutes before he came back, galloping furiously on a horse he had borrowed, and carrying a huge mirror across his neck. "I am in time, then," he cried, dismounting very carefully and placing the mirror against the trunk of a tree. "Give me your veil," he said hastily to the princess, and when she had unwound it from her head, he covered the mirror with it. "The moment the dragon comes near you, you must tear off the veil," he cried. "Be sure to hide behind the mirror. Have no fear, I shall be at hand." He and his horse had scarcely found shelter amongst the rocks when the flap of the dragon's wings could be heard plainly. He tossed his head with delight to the side of her and approached slowly to the place where she stood, a little in front of the mirror. Then, still looking the monster steadily in the face, she pressed one hand behind her back and snatched off the veil, stepping swiftly behind the tree as she did so. The princess had not known, when she obeyed the orders of the Knight of the Fish, what she expected to happen. Would the dragon with snarky lips be turned to stone, she wondered, like a dragon in the story her old nurse had told her, or would some fiery spark dart to the heart of the mirror and strike him dead? Neither of these things occurred, but instead, the dragon stopped short with surprise and rage when he saw a monster before him as big and as strong as himself. He shook his mane with rage and fury. The enemy in front did exactly the same. He lashed his tail and rolled his red eyes. The dragon opposite was no whit behind him. Opening his mouth to its very widest, he gave an awful roar, but the dragon only roared back. This was too much, and with another roar he made for the princess shake in her shoes. He flung himself upon his foe. In an instant the mirror lay at his feet broken in 1,000 pieces, but every piece reflected part of himself, and the dragon too thought that he had been smashed to atoms. In an instant, it was the moment for which the Knight of the Fish had watched and waited. Before the dragon could find out that he was not hurt at all, the young man's lance was down his throat, and he was rolling dead on the grass. Oh, what shouts of joy rang through the great city when the youth came riding back with the princess still behind him, and dragging the horrible monster by a cord. Everybody cried out that the king must give the victor the hand of the princess, and so he did. And not one had ever seen such balls and feasts and sports before. And when they were all over, the young couple went to the palace prepared for them, which was so large that it was 3 miles around. The first wet day after their marriage, the bridegroom begged the bride to show him all the rooms in the palace, and it was so big and took so long that the sun was shining brightly again before they stepped onto the roof to see the view. "What castle is that out there?" asked the knight. "It seems to be made of black marble." "It is called the Castle of Albatross." "Albatross!" answered the princess. "It is enchanted, and no one that has tried to enter it has ever come back." Her husband said nothing, but began to talk of something else. But the next morning he ordered his horse, took his spear, and called his bloodhound, and set off for the castle. It needed a brave man to approach it, for it made your hair stand on end merely to look at it, and it was dark as the night of a storm, and was silent as the grave. But the Knight of the Fish knew no fear, and had never turned his back on an enemy, so he drew out his horn and blew a blast. The sound awoke all the sleeping echoes in the castle, and was repeated so loudly, so softly, so near, now far, that nobody stirred for all of that. "Is there anyone inside?" cried the young man in his loudest voice. "Anyone who will give a knight hospitality? Neither governor nor squire, not even a page?" "Not even a page? Not even a page?" answered the echoes. But the young man did not heed them, and only struck a furious blow at the gate. Then a small grating opened, and there appeared the tip of a huge nose, which belonged to the ugliest woman that was ever seen. "What do you want?" said she. "To enter," he answered shortly. "Can I rest here this night, yes or no?" "No, no, no," repeated the echoes. Between the fierce sun and his anger at being kept waiting, the Knight of the Fish had grown so hot that he lifted his visor, and when the old woman saw how handsome he was, she began fumbling with the lock of the gate. Come in, she said. "So fine a gentleman will do us no harm." "Harm, harm, harm," repeated the echoes, but again the young man paid no heed. "Let us go in, ancient dame," but she interrupted him. "You must call me Lady Berserka," she answered sharply, "and this is my castle, to which I bid you welcome. You shall live here with me and my husband." But at these words the knight let his spear fall, so surprised he was. "Marry you? Well, you must be 100 at least," he cried. "You are mad, and I desire to inspect the castle, then go then." As he spoke, he heard voices give a mocking laugh. The old woman took no notice, and only bade the knights to follow her. Old as she was, though, she seemed impossible to tire. There was no room, however small, she did not lead him into, and each room was full of curious things he had never seen before. At length they came to a stone staircase, which was so dark that you could not see your hand if you held it up before your face. "I have kept the most precious treasure till the last," said the old woman. "But let me go first, for the stairs are steep, and you might easily break your leg." So on she went, now and then calling back to the young man in the darkness, but he did not know that she had slipped aside into a recess. Till suddenly he put his foot on the trap door, which gave way under him, and he fell down, down, as many good knights have done before him, and his voice joined the echoes of theirs. "So you would not marry me?" chuckled the old witch. Meanwhile, his brother had wandered far and wide, and at last he wandered back to the same great city where the other young knight had met with so many adventures. He noticed with amazement that when he walked the streets, the guards drew themselves up in a line and saluted him, and the drummers played the royal march. But he was still more bewildered when several servants in the library ran up to him and told him that the princess was sure something terrible had befallen him, and made herself ill with weeping. At last it occurred to him that once more he had been taken for his brother. "I'd better say nothing," he thought. "Perhaps I shall be able to help him after all." So he suffered himself to be borne in triumph to the palace, where the princess threw herself into his arms. "And so you did go to the castle?" she asked. "Yes, of course I did," answered he. "And what did you see there?" "I am forbidden to tell you anything about it until I have returned there once more," replied he. "Must you really go back to that dreadful place?" she asked wistfully. "You're the only man who has ever come back from it." "I must," he answered, and the princess, who was a wise woman, said only, "Oh, go to bed now, for I am sure to be very tired." But the knight only shook his head. "I have sworn never to lie in a bed as long as my work in the castle remains standing." And the princess again sighed and was silent. Early the next day, the young man started for the castle, feeling sure that something terrible must have happened to his brother. At the blast of his horn, the long nose of the old woman appeared in the grating. But the moment she caught sight of his face, she nearly fainted from fright, as she thought the ghost of the youth whose bones were lying in the dungeon of her castle. "Lady of all the ages," came the newcomer, "did you not give hospitality to a young knight a very short time ago?" "Short time ago, short time ago, short time ago," wailed the echoes. "And how have you ill-treated him?" he went on. "Ill-treated him, ill-treated him, ill-treated him," answered the voices. The woman did not stop to hear more. She turned to fly, but the knight's sword entered her body. "Where is my brother, cruel hag?" he asked sternly. "I'll tell you," she said. "But as I feel I'm going to die, I shall keep the piece of news to myself till you have brought me to life again." The young man laughed scornfully. "How do you propose that I should work that miracle?" "Oh, it is quite easy. Go into the garden and gather the flowers of the everlasting plant and some dragon's blood. Crush them together and boil them in a large tub of water. Then put me into it." The knight did as the old witch bade him, and, sure enough, she came out quite whole, but uglier than ever. Then she told the young man what had become of his brother, and he went down into the dungeon and brought up his body and the bodies of the other victims who lay there. And when they were all washed in the magic water, their strength was restored to them. And beside these, he found in another cavern the bodies of girls who had been sacrificed to the dragon, and brought them back to life also. As to the witch, in the end she died of rage at seeing her prey escape her, and at the moment she drew her last breath, the castle of Albatross fell into ruins with a great noise. Sorry, that castle was named Albatross. I wonder if that's just a translation thing or not. I don't know. But that's the end of the book. So, yeah, what do you think? Albatross! Oh! I want to wait until after Halloween to start another book. Which, gives me 2 weeks, I guess. I'm not sure what I'll do next week. I might see if I can do haunted houses. I don't know. I may just play reruns or something. But we need to find someone to raid. Question is, who's actually on. Because none of my regular friends seem to be on. I could do something really insane and raid someone with like 300 viewers right now. What say you, chat? Should I be insane? Probably get nothing at all out of it. You know what? Fuck it. I'm gonna try it. So, if you're a follower, feel free to use the first message. If you're a subscriber, there's that one. And guess I will see you Monday for some gaming. Probably do Baldur's Gate some more. But until then, I hope you have a good weekend. Don't get too spooked by the haunts going on. And hopefully I'll see you then.
In the hollow of the night, shadows weave and twist. The wolf has told his stories, wrapped in mystic mist, lurking in the silence where the echoes softly play. The echoes of forgotten tales, dimming as they sway. The hours drip like candle wax, slowly melting gold. Lands of frost and twilight, secrets yet untold. The forest breeze a shiver, its ancient heartbeats thrum. Underneath the silver glow, the wild whispers come. Time to close the book, let the pages fall. You've roamed the winding paths, now heed the twilight call. The moon is setting low, a guardian in the sky. Time to dim the lights, let the worldly worries die. Into dreams we go, where shadows softly play. Embrace the gentle darkness, let it guide your way. Whispers curl like smoke from the